Welcome everyone to U.S. Poverty in the Midst of Prosperity. This is week 2. We're going to begin with a couple of fun facts. From 1861 until 1912, there was only one Democratic president. Who was he? The answer is Grover Cleveland, who served 2 different terms. And how many U.S. presidents were from the state of Ohio? There were 8. And as you can see here, many of them were in the time period that we're going to be discussing today. Now, from the last time, we said that we were looking at the remedies to poverty in the U.S. in categories, 2 large categories, before the Great Depression and New Deal of the 1930s, and the second category being after the Great Depression or New Deal of the 1930s. We covered these 3 topics in last week's lecture. We're going to be looking at saving children and progressivism today, as well as Social Security, the war on poverty, and the war against welfare. The Industrial Revolution really consisted of 2 parts. The first Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s and the early 1800s began in Great Britain and spread to the United States, and really was based upon 2 major things. That is steam engines, which then were used in factories. They were used for boats, steamboats, and they were used for railroads. So we think of the fuel being coal, which then was used to produce steam. And then we also think of iron in the first Industrial Revolution. Well, just as kind of coal, steam, and iron were components of the first Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution of the mid to late 19th century, so the 1850s, 1860s on to the early 20th century, the hallmarks of that were steel production, so actually making iron into steel through processes like the Bessemer and other process, and to be able to make that steel effectively and in great quantities and cheaply. And then oil would become the new fuel eventually of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution was also marked by industrial chemistry. So for those of you who are chemists, people like Charles Goodyear, who could take all kinds of inventions, say for instance with rubber tires, as in Goodyear tires, and make very practical applications for them. Other very practical U.S. inventions of the time period included the air brake, the telephone, the incandescent electric light bulb, sewing machine, cash register, phonograph, film camera, motion picture camera, the all-electric starting motor, and from 2 brothers from Dayton, Ohio, the Wright brothers, the first manned heavier-than-air flight. So during the Industrial Revolutions of this time period, transportation rapidly improved. It used to take a sailing ship to cross the Atlantic 1 to 3 months. With steamships, that journey was, by 1850, made in 11 days and 8 hours. In 1866, the first telegraph line crossed the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, tying, of course, the Old World with the New World. During the same time, immigrants were leaving Europe for economic opportunities in the United States and elsewhere. From 1850 to 1920, in that short 70-year period, more than 25 million immigrants came to the United States. Many of them began to settle in cities, as we'll see in a lecture a few weeks from now. And for instance, in Lowell, Massachusetts, by 1855, more than 60% of the employees of the cotton mills there were Irish. The U.S. would grow in its industrial production. By 1860, the United States ranked second to Britain in industrial production in the entire world. And by the early 1880s, the United States surpassed Britain in industrial production. That industrial production was also matched by all kinds of business and marketing innovations. And the first of those was by a Scottish immigrant by the name of Andrew Carnegie, who came to the U.S. at age 12. He worked in a factory, made his money off of steel, saved his money, and made some great investments, and founded the Carnegie Steel Corporation. Now, he believed in philanthropy, so during his life he gave away some $300 million, mostly to establish libraries throughout the United States. These are known as the Carnegie Libraries. But he did all of this at the expense, really, of his factory workers, who worked for low wages, generally worked 12-hour days, 6 days per week. Now, one of the things that Andrew Carnegie was known for was vertical integration. At least he helped to pioneer this and to popularize it. By vertical integration, we mean that with his steel mills, for instance, he began to actually purchase coal and iron ore mines. He would need the coal to fire the furnaces, and the furnaces then would heat up the iron ore to make steel. So he bought up these. Those raw materials he used in his manufacturing process in his steel mills, such as the steel mill here near Pittsburgh. And then, in order to transport the finished goods, he got involved, and also, to transport some of the raw materials as well, and transportation, beginning to buy up Great Lakes shipping lines. Now, just as Andrew Carnegie was known for his vertical integration, a real pioneer of horizontal integration was John G. Rockefeller, who made his money in oil. Oil was initially used for things like lamps, to light lamps, to lubricate machinery, all the machinery that was needed, the steam machinery for factories, and of course the steam machinery used in railroads and steamships and steamboats, etc. Only later on would oil really become used for fueling things like automobiles and airplanes, which of course came later. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company, and he was really known for how he could get good rebates, good deals from the railroads. He would assure the railroads that he would continue to give them his business as long as they treated him well, and that meant provided him with special rebates. This meant that in some cases the railroad companies were actually paying for his shipping costs. The rebates sometimes were greater than the costs that they gave him to ship things. This, of course, made people very suspicious of the growing power of John D. Rockefeller, and in fact, he had pretty well established a monopoly. Monopolies are an example of what can happen when horizontal integration becomes very prevalent. So in other words, Rockefeller and his company, the Standard Oil Company, began buying up other oil companies, competing companies. And when they couldn't exactly buy up the other companies, they would have trustees of the Standard Oil Company swapping stock with those other companies and serving as trustees of those other oil companies. Now, the federal government really saw that as a restraint of trade, but the Standard Oil Company got around that by kind of reinventing itself as a holding company that bought competing companies. Either way, Standard Oil was a monopoly. It controlled prices, it controlled the territory, the distribution. By the 1890s, it controlled 90% of the oil business. It employed 100,000 people, and according to one historian, was the biggest, richest, most feared, and most admired business organization in the world. Rockefeller himself became the nation's first billionaire, dying at age 98 in 1937. Ida Tarbell, a journalist, ran a scathing denunciation of Rockefeller and Standard Oil in the very popular McClure's magazine of the time period, and he entitled his series The History of the Standard Oil Company. Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company really was one of the things that helped propel people's very kind of negative image of some of these large corporations and some of these millionaires and billionaires who seem to be making money off the middle class and off the poor working class, off the factory workers and other unskilled laborers. And in fact, that whole age of the late 19th century gained the term of Gilded Age because obviously some of the millionaires and billionaires had these beautiful homes and wonderful jewelry. The idea of being gilded in a golden age takes its name actually from an 1873 novel by none other than Mark Twain and also Charles Dudley Warren. Great fortunes were to be made in the late 19th century in the Second Industrial Revolution, and they were made by people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, and others, the so-called robber barons. But at the same time period that great fortunes were made, there was a growing gap between rich and poor in the United States. There was little regulation of corporations at that time, and a growth of a national consumer culture. And the reason why you could have a national consumer culture, for those of you who are in marketing or business or advertising, is because all of a sudden now you have things like steamboats and railroads tying the nation together, closer together than it had ever been before, and the beginnings of really mass advertising, that whole idea of advertising to the masses and making them realize that what they need is the latest product to buy, whatever that might be. There were also many boom and bust cycles in the stock market and resultant national depressions that occurred during this time period. The two worst depressions of the late 19th century were 1873 and 1893, and we'll be making reference to them in a minute. Bankers like J.P. Morgan financed large corporations such as General Electric and United States Steel. When the railroads had overbuilt and started to have financial problems in the 1890s, J.P. Morgan reorganized them so that literally a handful of directors controlled the nation's rail network. Morgan also bought Carnegie Steel and other steel companies and created the massive corporation United States Steel. So all of this is happening in terms of the economy and corporations. But what is happening in terms of the social outlooks of the time? Well, many of you know that Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century came up with this theory of evolution, of survival of the fittest. Some people, such as Herbert Spencer of Britain and William Graham Sumner of Yale University here in the United States, applied that theory of Charles Darwin of evolution and his survival of the fittest to society in general. And social Darwinism began then to, in the name of progress of the human race, to justify neglect of the poor. Now, remember we've talked about the deserving poor, the undeserving poor, right? And in this case, they would have said that the undeserving poor were really not as evolved as, say, middle class and wealthy people. And because of that, they deserve to be poor. And in fact, you know, if you did too much for them, you were just encouraging them to, continue to get married, have children, and have their gene pool, so to speak, continue. And that this would not be in the best interest of the human race, because the human race, like all other species, had to operate through regulations and rules of the survival of the fittest. Well, besides the social outlooks, and of course not everyone thought that, some people thought that, and some people used that theory to justify their actions. But besides that, the U.S. Supreme Court was very much a believer at that time in laissez-faire. And we've talked about laissez-faire before. It means to let alone. It means that they thought that the United States government should not get involved, should not interfere with business. And they used as their justification for this the Due Process Clause of the Fifth and 14th Amendments to uphold laissez-faire. And that Due Process Clause deals with the following: that no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you say, well, what do you mean persons? What about these large corporations? Well, the United States Supreme Court viewed corporations as collective persons, collective people. Hence, the Supreme Court struck down state laws regulating railroad rates. It declared income tax unconstitutional, and it even thought that labor unions could be a conspiracy in restraint of trade. And it is to those labor unions now that we look. We said that there was a Great Depression, a panic of 1873. And during that depression, there was wages were cut for people all across the United States. And in the summer of 1877, as the Depression was still lingering, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages of its workers. And its workers in the state of West Virginia went on strike. They were joined by many others throughout the nation in what was called the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It involved 100,000 striking railroad employees as well as 500,000 other laborers across the United States who were sympathetic to the cause. Violence and vandalism ensued. The governors of 9 states asked President Rutherford B. Hayes, who, by the way, was from Ohio, to send in federal troops to quell the disorder. He did so, and the strike eventually died down. Now, one of the things, besides the railroad workers themselves, many of the farmers in the United States were upset over the railroads. The farmers were having a hard time in the late 19th century in the United States. They were very oftentimes finding themselves in debt, borrowing from banks, either to buy land, buy equipment, buy seed, to get over the humps of bad harvest, which might have been caused by drought, bad weather, any number of pestilences or pests. And the poor farmers and the kind of middle-class farmers came to regard railroads as in a negative vein for favoring large companies like Standard Oil, giving Standard Oil and other large companies all kinds of rebates and special treatment. Some states began establishing railroad commissions and passing laws in an attempt to regulate the railroads, but these were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in a major decision known as Wabash v. Illinois in 1886. This Supreme Court decision argued that railroads fell under federal jurisdiction because they were interstate. That is, they went interstate, and according to the Constitution, the federal government was charged with interstate matters. In 1887, in response, the U.S. Congress passed and President Cleveland signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which was an attempt to regulate the railroads. But it really lacked the teeth to be all that important at this time. Meanwhile, other groups of labor unions in the United States were founded and were striking and were trying to obtain rights for their workers. The first major labor union in the United States was the Knights of Labor, founded by Uriah Stevens in 1869 in Philadelphia. And it accepted workers regardless, and this was very radical for its day, regardless of skill, sex, race, or nationality. The only people that it didn't allow to join the union were what it regarded as the parasites of the system. And that would include people like gamblers, stockbrokers, sorry to say this for those of you who might want to be, lawyers, bankers, and liquor dealers. So you can clearly see what the Knights of Labor was kind of all about. It was headed for years by a man who was called Terence Powderly. And eventually it came to embrace such radical reforms as the public ownership of railroads, an income tax, equal pay for women workers, and the abolition of child labor. It had, by 1886, 730,000 members nationwide. A smaller labor union, but nonetheless important one, was the American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers in 1881. It was for skilled craftsmen, not for unskilled laborers, but for skilled craftsmen. And it used strikes to improve working conditions and wages. By 1886, it had 138,000 members. Well, the clarion call of many labor unions and of workers was the 8-hour day. Workers were distraught at having to work very oftentimes 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. So the 8-hour day became the clarion call of workers. And workers throughout the United States and labor unions set a day, May 1st, 1886, as the date for a general strike in the United States to achieve the 8-hour day. Laborers gathered in the city of Chicago, and leaders included, unfortunately, people like anarchists and socialists, so that the thing got a bit out of hand. In Chicago, workers at the McCormick plant, which had been founded by Cyrus McCormick. The McCormick plant made harvesters, reapers. They tried to get around the strike by hiring scabs to work. And then they called out and they hired their own detective agency, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And at one point in time, workers attacked the scabs at the McCormick plant. Police fired. So again, things were heating up. Radicals called for a meeting at Chicago's Haymarket Square several days later for May 4th. 2,000 or so people gathered. Someone threw a bomb in Haymarket Square, no one knows who. Police began firing, and a number of dead and wounded was the result. 4 people were executed, 3 sent to prison, and from this day forward, labor unions made May 1st, May Day, an international celebration of the worker. Another vast strike was held at one of the Carnegie steel mills in a little suburban town outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called Homestead, Pennsylvania. Carnegie did not want to renew his plant's contract with the AFL's Association of Iron and Steel Workers, even though Carnegie believed that workers had a right to unionize. Only a minority, about 1 out of every 5 of the employees of his plant were union. So Carnegie went off to Scotland and left a man in charge, Henry Frick, F-R-I-C-K, and a strike ensued. Frick built a 15-foot fence around the steel mill and hired more than 300 Pinkerton guards. And on June 28th, he locked out strikers and hired scabs to take their place. At 4 a.m. on July 6, Pinkertons arrived via 2 barges on the Monongahela River. 1,000 people met them, angry people with everything they could get their hands on, pitchforks, fence posts, and violence ensued. More than a dozen Pinkertons and some 30 strikers fell, killed or wounded. The crowd grew to 10,000. Workers took over the mill. The governor called in the National Guard, and the Guard stayed for 95 days. An anarchist even attempted, unsuccessfully, to assassinate Henry Frick. In November, workers were rehired, but note, at reduced wages. No union leaders were allowed back. And the company brought back the 12-hour workday for its workers. So no results were made. Pullman in Pullman, Illinois was another great strike well known for its day. After the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had occurred, George Pullman, a manufacturer of railroad passenger cars, decided that what needed to be done was to build a company town. He did so 9 miles south of Chicago. The town was called Pullman, Illinois. It was owned by him. It had a library, schools, fountains, parks, but no saloons. He didn't want his workers drinking. All of the housing was rental. Rents were high. And some people began to criticize this whole idea of a company town. Well, that was in the 1870s, 1880s. In 1893, this Great Depression hit the United States. And Pullman did what many other corporate bosses did. He cut the wages of his workers. However, he did not cut the rents that he charged them for their houses. A massive strike began. It spread among railroad workers nationwide who refused to handle Pullman cars. The mail was being affected, and so President Cleveland called in the army. Violence erupted, and Pullman reopened his factory, mainly with new workers. The election of 1888, we just need to go back just a little bit here to deal with now a wholly different issue, and this is the gold versus silver issue. And it also another issue related to it, and that is the tariff. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison, a Republican and one of the presidents who would come from Ohio, won the election. At that time, Grover Cleveland, who he was running against, lost. One of the major issues was the tariff. And everyone knows that a tariff is a government duty on imported goods. Now, farmers in the Midwest and the South of the United States disliked high tariffs because they wanted to buy consumer goods, and quite frankly, they didn't care whether the consumer goods came from Britain, Germany, or any other place, as long as the consumer goods were reasonably priced. And tariffs made those consumer goods more high-priced. On the other hand, manufacturers and others in the North and the Northeast really liked the tariff because what they were trying to do is to build up American industry. Cleveland, who was running against Harrison, wanted tariff reform because the tariff, he believed, hurt farmers and hurt the expansion of American industry abroad. You know, if you put a tariff on somebody else's goods, they're going to end up, another country, putting a tariff against your goods, so that's really not going to help you in the long run. Now, Harrison won. Harrison supported the tariff, and Harrison won. And as people said, Harrison didn't have much of a personality. People literally called him the human iceberg. Subsequently, the Republicans in Congress passed the highest tariff ever in 1890. And the fact of the matter was, a lot of American people had elected Harrison to preserve the tariff, but they had not elected him to have a higher tariff, an even higher tariff, passed. So in the congressional elections a couple years later in 1890, Republicans were swept from office nationwide. Some new legislation was passed. One was a new antitrust act, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, but it was too weak. It still allowed things like holding companies, and in actuality, this act would later on be turned against the unions because it would be used to see the labor unions as themselves a restraint of trade. In 1890, a new Sherman Silver Purchase Act had been passed. Now, a little history behind this. The United States had, and you can read about this in your articles for this week, especially the stuff that I've written on the bimetallic system, monetary system, on the gold standard, etc. So I won't repeat too much of this as you can read it. But the United States had technically been a bimetallic country. That is, it would take both gold and silver and mint it into coins, and both were accepted and used by people. Now, gold tended always sort of to keep its high exchange rates. Silver was more up and down. There was a lot of silver in the United States, a lot of it out west, and basically in 1873, Congress had basically passed a law calling for the end of minting silver. People referred to this as the crime of 73. So from 1873 to 1890, the U.S. government had stopped buying silver for minting it into coins. Now, farmers and other debtors were very upset. They wanted to see the minting of silver because the minting of silver would devalue the currency and lead to inflation. And devaluing a currency and leading to inflation is generally something that farmers and other debtors sort of like. And let me give you a very simplistic example. Say, for instance, that you graduate from college and you have $20,000 in student loans to pay off. And you get a job that pays $40,000. Well, that's a heavy burden. But 5 years from now, you get a new job and it pays $60,000, okay? Now, you know, your salary has gone up, and maybe prices have even gone up, but what hasn't gone up is your debt in relation to the prices and your wages, your salary, which have all gone up. And maybe you went ahead and had married someone, and maybe you had a bit of a nest egg between the two of you to put a little down payment on a house. Maybe you bought it for $100,000, and 10 years later it's worth $200,000. You see, inflation can be helpful for folks who are debtors, because now you have a $200,000 house where you had a $100,000 house, and your mortgage hasn't gone up, and your salary has gone up, etc., etc. So farmers wanted silver. They wanted silver to devalue the currency and to lead to inflation. Silver versus gold will become a major thing in the election of 1892 and thereafter, especially in the Depression of 1893. The election of 1892, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, won. Unfortunately for him, a national depression struck in 1893. Cleveland's Secretary of the Treasury in his second term was none other than John G. Carlisle, pictured here, of Covington, Kentucky. That is the northern Kentucky suburbs of Cincinnati. John D. Carlisle was a gold standard man. He believed in gold. So Cleveland followed Carlisle's lead and supported the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. They were hoping, Carlisle and Cleveland were hoping to strengthen confidence in the economy by basing it on gold. The repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act was a failure. Gold was streaming out of the Treasury, and J.P. Morgan and others had to buy gold overseas to prop up the economic system. It was a major disaster. So this 1893 depression, the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, is all getting farmers more and more upset. Already by the 1880s, farmers were hurting, and they had begun establishing farmers' alliances all throughout the United States. These claimed more than 3 million members. They did things like hold picnics and fairs. Of course, they didn't have alcohol at them. They'd have lectures, but more importantly, they would establish cooperatives to sell their crops so that they could get a fair price. They called for railroad regulation, and all of these little farmers' alliances eventually led to the establishment of a new political party founded in St. Louis, Missouri in 1892. It was called the Populist Party. And in fact, in 1892, the Populists ran a candidate for the presidential election. He got more than 1 million votes, but he didn't win. And their platform was seemingly very radical. They wanted government ownership of railroads. They wanted silver, the free and unlimited coinage of silver that would bring more money into the economy. They wanted direct election of U.S. senators. Remember, back then, senators were, until a new amendment was eventually passed, senators were elected by state legislatures. They wanted the secret ballot. Believe it or not, back then, there was not, in most of the United States, a secret ballot. If you went to vote, it was usually a voice vote. Other people could hear it. Other people would know whom you were voting for. It was not a secret ballot. They wanted a couple of different forms of legislation, which we call today initiative, referendum, and recall. That is the power to initiate legislation, to hold a referendum on things, to recall officials. And of course, they wanted the 8-hour workday. The 1893 Depression was long-lasting. In spring 1894, 100 unemployed Americans, led by Jacob Coxey of Ohio, started a march from the state of Ohio to Washington, D.C. They wanted to express their needs as unemployed people in this depression. As they went along, the numbers swelled. They arrived in the U.S. Capitol on May 1st. They were arrested by police for walking on the grass of the Capitol grounds. People weren't seemingly being listened to. The election of 1896 featured the Democrats nominating William Jennings Bryan, who campaigned by delivering more than 600 speeches across the country and traveling 18,000 miles. There was a heavy voter turnout in the election of 1896. 80% of the people turned out. The populists supported Bryan, but William McKinley, a Republican from Ohio, won. Bryan was best known when he accepted the Democratic nomination in Chicago for his Cross of Gold speech, where he said that we should do not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So obviously, he and the Democrats and the populists were silver people. Eventually, all of these strikes and marches would lead to some changes whereby a new movement, a response to the abuses of the Gilded Age, arose called progressivism. The progressive movement wanted to regulate the capitalist system through democratic means. At the same time, a number of Christians believed that they had a social responsibility to help reform society and to help the poor. This was called the social gospel. Progressivism and the social gospel, in many ways, were evidenced by wonderful, well-educated women like Jane Addams, who wanted to use their talents in giving back to society. So Jane Addams bought a large house in an urban slum of Chicago, and she opened up and had many women who helped her, lived with her and helped her. They helped immigrants with English classes. They taught women to sew. They provided daycare and kindergarten facilities so that women could go out to work. They worked politically to end child labor. They built playgrounds in the area. They worked to improve garbage collection, just about everything imaginable. These settlement houses were popular throughout the United States, and Cincinnati had one as well. Women also formed their own trade union, the Women's Trade Union League, or the WTUL. Founded in 1903, it was a labor union for working women. And in 1909, it organized the Uprising of the 20,000. Women employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City went out on strike protesting bad working conditions and low pay. They were joined by 20,000 garment workers. They gained concessions, but still their union was not recognized and working conditions remained poor. How poor would be shown 2 years later in 1911, when a fire struck the multi-story factory of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City. The workers were locked inside to keep them from going out and taking breaks and having a smoke, etc. And with the doors locked, it was a complete disaster. 146 people died. Some women leapt to their deaths from the 9th floor rather than to be burned alive. Another thing that was occurring at this time period was an attempt to turn social Darwinism on its head, what we call Reform Darwinism. Believers in Reform Darwinism said, yes, Charles Darwin is right, there is such a thing as evolution, there is such a thing they believed as human evolution, but they believed that unlike all those other species, that humans had a brain, and that they could use that brain to collectively work together and to come to practical solutions to problems. Meanwhile, there were all kinds of other people working on scientific management kinds of theories. People like Frederick Winslow Taylor, who began to study factories and look for ways to make the machines and the humans working the machines more efficient, cutting out unnecessary steps, etc. Well, President McKinley was assassinated at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901 by a deranged anarchist, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became president. And almost immediately he announced a square deal for the American people. Now you're going to hear about Teddy Roosevelt's square deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and Truman's Fair Deal today at the lecture. He went after the trust, all of those monopolies, the horizontal integration, starting with the Northern Security, a trust controlled by J.P. Morgan that dealt with a lot of transcontinental railroads. He brought suit against that. The U.S. Supreme Court supported him in that effort, and Roosevelt pursued 42 other antitrust suits. Under his administration in 1903, the Elkins Act was passed, making those rebates from railroads illegal. Also, a Department of Commerce and Labor was created in the Roosevelt administration. And during the anthracite coal strike of 1902, Roosevelt became the first U.S. president to try to bring a settlement, that is, arbitration, to a major strike. In this case, he brought together the coal miners, a union, that is the United Mine Workers, and the owners of the coal mines. And the strike was settled. In the 1904 presidential election, Roosevelt won, defeating the Democratic character, the Democratic candidate, and he Roosevelt cited an allegorical character in Pilgrim's Progress. And basically what Roosevelt was saying by this is that he believed that, in going after the large trust and trying to regulate things so the government, so that the economy worked well, but he didn't believe in going too far. So he cites this allegorical character in Pilgrim's Progress who was so busy raking muck, and you can imagine what muck is, that he took no notice of higher things. And so he kind of coined for our language, Roosevelt's criticism coined a new word, muckraker. And it really described a lot of the people who were raking up muck, raking up the dirt that was out there in politics and the economy. Among those well-known muckrakers were authors like Upton Sinclair, who in The Jungle his book The Jungle, exposed the filthy conditions in meatpacking plants, and as a result, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Roosevelt loved the outdoors. He promoted conservation. He saved some 16 million acres of federal land, mainly in the West, for reserves, created 6 national parks, 16 national monuments, and 51 wildlife refuges. In 1908, the 1908 presidential election featured William Howard Taft of Cincinnati, Ohio, who was Republican, versus William Jennings Bryan. Taft won. He also pursued antitrust suits like his friend Teddy Roosevelt. But one of his big mistakes was not vetoing a new tariff act called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. This increased tariffs, pleased businesses, but did not please farmers and the common American. In the 1912 presidential election, Taft, as the Republican, ran again. By this time, Teddy Roosevelt was no longer so cozy with his friend Taft. He was mad at him for a number of things, said some nasty things about him, and Roosevelt decided to run on his own in his own party, an independent party, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party, they called it. And then Woodrow Wilson was the Democratic candidate. And in essence, Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican Party vote, and hence Wilson, the Democrat, won. Wilson would bring about even more reforms. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913 brought about federal income tax. The 17th Amendment brought about direct election of senators. The Federal Trade Commission in 1914 to prosecute corporations for unfair trade practices. The Clayton Antitrust Act, which outlawed unfair competition. The Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve System of big banks, to oversee, the banking system in the United States. The Keat-Nowen child labor law, which outlawed regular employment of children younger than age 16. And so many things were being done in this progressive era to improve the plight of workers. However, a number of people did not feel that either the Republicans or the Democrats were going far enough. These included the Socialist Party, followers of Eugene V. Debs. Debs, in fact, ran for president in the United States 5 different times. They included the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or sometimes referred to as Wobblies, who were a very radical labor union for unskilled workers that really hoped that one day the capitalist system would be overturned. Now, before we look at the Great Depression, I want to mention one person, and that is Henry Ford. Originally, Henry Ford was an electrical engineer with Detroit Edison Electric. With other investors, he opened the Ford Motor Company in 1903 and introduced the Model T, a 4-cylinder car available in one color only at that time, black, and it sold for $850. In 1908, he studied meatpacking plants throughout the United States and how meatpacking plants moved animal carcasses from point to point on overhead hooks. So by 1913, he introduced this idea, a moving assembly line, based upon what he saw at meatpacking plants, to his Ford factory. In 1914, it took 93 minutes to assemble a car, which actually was just 10% of the time it had taken less than a year before. So the moving assembly line decreased the amount of time it took to make a car down to 93 minutes. By 1925, so that would be 11 years later, he was turning out more than 9,000 cars a day, or one every 10 seconds. One every 10 seconds instead of one every 93 minutes. And the result was the price of the Model T came down from the initial price of $850 to below $300. Many people could afford a Model T. Now, assembly line work was boring, so there was a high turnover rate with his workers. So in 1914, he increased wages to $5 a day, which was about $2 more than prevailing wages at the time. Keep in mind all of this as we look at some other things. Now, I want you to read over this list because you have a reading about child-saving efforts, which fits right into this whole progressivism. Here's a list of things that were done at that time period. Now we turn to the Great Depression from 1929 to 1940. One of the great historians of this depression, Amity Shlaes, says in the book The Forgotten Man, American capitalism did not break in 1929. The crash did not cause the depression. Well, if the crash of the stock market did not cause the depression, what were the overall causes of the depression's duration? Number one was inequity of wealth. For decades, farmers had been squeezed by low farm prices and by high debt. They had low incomes. For industrial workers, wages simply did not keep up with productivity and with corporate profits. In fact, nearly 2 out of every 3 American families lived on less than $2,000 per year. And economists estimate that that would have supplied only the basic necessities. In sharp contrast, the top 1% received 15% of the nation's income. So before the Great Depression occurred, the inequity of wealth, the disparity of wealth between rich and poor, had increased to a large gulf. There were also credit problems. The economy depended on middle-class consumerism, but the middle class was being encouraged to buy more and more on credit. By the end of the 1920s, there were 2 very popular consumer products, automobiles and radios. And by the end of the 1920s, 4 out of 5 cars and 2 out of 3 radios were bought on credit. Personal indebtedness rose to an all-time high, and that indebtedness could not be maintained. Number 3, there were agricultural problems. There was a great dust bowl in the 1930s, and we can read all about that in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and the problems that that caused to the economy. Number 4, there were international economic problems. The war reparations that had been leveled on Germany after World War I were a very bad idea. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised U.S. tariffs to an historic high, triggered another international tariff war just at the time when the world least needed it. And there were corporate structural problems as well. Holding companies, investment trust, the buying of stocks on margin, which we're going to explain here, leveraging, etc. So, the Depression hits, and the president is Herbert Hoover. He had been an orphan from Iowa. He rose to become an internationally respected mining engineer. Hoover was a hero of his day. At the end of World War II, he was given the job of being the food administrator who would feed the hungry in Belgium at the end of World War I, and he did a fantastic job of doing that. He was Commerce Secretary under President Calvin Coolidge, and it was he, Hoover, who oversaw the very successful relief efforts to help rebuild and to feed the poor who were the victims of the horrible flood of 1927 along the Mississippi River. Hoover led the cooperation of 7 states to build what later became the Hoover Dam. It was called the Hoover Dam, initially the Boulder Dam. Times were good when he became president. Unemployment was only 3.2% in the mid-1920s. Hoover did not like the speculation that we're going to be talking about in the stock market. He thought that buying stocks on margins were a bad idea. But again, there's not much that he felt that he could do against it. During the election of 1928, Hoover ran against Al Smith, the nation's first Catholic to run for president. Hoover was actually more of a progressive than many people in the Republican Party. In fact, in August 1928, he said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us," end quote. But the stock market entered free fall, and the systemic problems in the economic structure of the United States kept the nation firmly entrenched in a Great Depression that spread worldwide by spring of 1931. Hoover was convinced that the problems were international in scope, and he required an international solution. He proposed a moratorium on all war debts. He established government home loan banks that helped pay mortgages on farms and homes instead of foreclosing on them. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, to provide federal government loans to businesses, banks, railroads, etc. But all of these efforts were too little. Shanty towns sprang up all across the nation where the unemployed poor who had been thrown out of their homes or their apartments would set up shanties, and quickly they earned the name of Hoovervilles. A sad testimony was the Bonus Army of 1932. Veterans of World War I who were promised a bonus in 1945 marched on Washington, wanting the bonus now and then. They set up camp in Washington, D.C., and General Douglas MacArthur burned their camp down, and they were dispersed by him. The election of 1932 would bring a new man to the office of president, but first we have to consider what happened at the stock market crash of Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. I'm going to give you a very simple example. Back then, you could actually buy stocks on margin. That is, you only had to have 1/10 of the actual money to put down. The rest of it you could borrow. So let's say you bought one stock selling at $10 using $1 of your own money and $9 borrowed from the bank. Then the stock price drops to $5. The bank asked for its $9, but you don't have it. So the bank calls in the stock. You lose $1 plus any interest that you've paid on your loan from the bank. The bank sells the stock for $5, but you borrowed $9 for them, so the bank actually loses $4. Total loss now is $5. Meanwhile, lots of other people are dumping that stock and other stocks, and the stock prices continue to spiral downward. The economy is essentially in free fall. How and when does it stop? Well, Herbert Hoover ran again. Of course, he lost to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom we sometimes call FDR. We said in the last lecture that classical economists thought that the economy was inherently stable. John Maynard Keynes was an economist from Great Britain who turned that on its head. And the Keynesian economist said that the economy was inherently unstable. And because of that, it would require government intervention, priming the pump, literally the government pouring money into the economy to do whatever it could to go ahead and employ people and just get the economy running again. FDR was willing to try just about anything. He declared a new deal for the American people, and his first 100 days in office are called literally that, the first 100 days. The first thing he did was declare a bank holiday. All banks were closed. Federal examiners came in to inspect the bank's books, and those that were solvent were allowed to reopen. Those that were not could not reopen. He also began his famous radio fireside chats. So every week he would have a fireside chat on radio. Millions of people nationwide would listen to them, these chats, and he would be able to instill confidence in them. He also saw to the passing of a new banking act the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. This was the second Glass-Steagall Banking Act. The first one was under Hoover. And the one under FDR established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, which still exists today and guaranteed bank deposits to a certain amount. He also wanted to get people employed again. And for the younger people, aged 18 to 25, he began the Civilian Conservation Corps, which worked on conservation projects in rural areas and in parks. So it built park trails and cabins, it fixed soil erosion problems, it reforested forests, and it employed eventually 250,000 people. He also wanted to prop up agriculture. The farmers had had such low prices being paid for their agricultural goods that the Agricultural Adjustment Act established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which literally paid farmers subsidies to reduce their production. The U.S. Supreme Court would later on declare the AAA unconstitutional, and we'll see how FDR got around that. He established the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, which dammed rivers in places like Tennessee and Kentucky and other places, and then the dams were used for hydroelectric power. They also helped with flood control and produced opportunities for recreation. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, was headed by Harry Hopkins, and it provided grants to states for work relief. And this was meant to be a temporary agency, along with another kind of companion agency, the Civil Works Administration, which provided, again, federal work relief for construction of schools, roads, playgrounds, etc. Roosevelt, FDR, also wanted to make certain that they cleaned up this whole problem with the selling of stocks and securities. He did that through the Securities Act of 1933. And then he realized that if things were going to get off the ground again with the economy, he would need the cooperation of businesses, especially large businesses, but small businesses as well. And he attained that to a fairly good extent in the National Industrial Recovery Act, where he literally sat down with the businesses and asked industries to institute blanket codes for prices and wages so they weren't undercutting one another, and so that they could stabilize employment and counter what was happening there was this great deflation. The NRA Charter also recognized the right of workers to form unions and to bargain collectively. It established the Public Works Administration, which loaned money to states and municipalities for public works projects. Now, in 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the NIRA unconstitutional. Okay. FDR also created the Farm Credit Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation to provide refinancing of mortgages for farms and for loans, and then the 100 days ended. In 1934, he founded the Federal Housing Administration to ensure low-interest mortgages that would guarantee to pay the lender if the homeowner defaulted. And between 1938 and 41, the FHA insured mortgages. Up to 34% of new home mortgages were FHA insured. He set up the Security and Exchange Commission in 1934 to oversee the stock market, etc. And then he began in 1935 the Second New Deal, what is sometimes called the Second New Deal. This was necessary because in 1935 the U.S. Supreme Court had declared both the NIRA and the AAA unconstitutional. The economy was not getting much better. By 1935, 20% of the people were still unemployed. And there were many critics of FDR and what he was doing, mainly radical critics. People like Dr. Francis Townsend of California, who proposed that there should be a federal pension plan for Americans over the age of 60. That's something that FDR would listen to. Father Charles Coughlin of Michigan, the so-called radio priest, who called for economic justice, including the nationalization of the banking system. Henry Long Huey Long, Huey P. Long, the Kingfisher, Louisiana, former governor of Louisiana. He was a U.S. senator at that time. He fought the power of big business banks, founded the Share Our Wealth Society. He wanted the federal government to tax the rich heavily, to tax inheritances, to confiscate family fortunes over $5 million, to put 100% tax on incomes of over $1 million per year. He wanted each family to be given a house, a car, and assured annual income. He was proposing, Huey P. Long, some radical things. In 1935, to replace the NIRA, which had been declared unconstitutional, FDR saw to the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, which gave workers the right to unionize and to engage in collective bargaining. But the biggest thing that we will remember, right, that comes out of the Second New Deal is the Social Security Act of 1935, and then the next year, the Aid to Dependent Children of 1936. Social Security Act was a social insurance program providing benefits for the retired, for unemployed, blind, handicapped, and dependent children. Also, Works Progress, later on called Works Projects Administration, or the WPA, again under the direction of Harry Hopkins. Between 1935 and 1942, the WPA spent over $15 billion employing people in building new sewers and schools and post offices, highways, roads, bridges, and streets. It even employed writers, artists, musicians, archivists, etc. And there was a National Youth Administration, which provided part-time jobs so that men and women could stay in high school and college and pursue their degrees. Now, in 1936, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and so the Congress passed it under a new guise called the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. And this way, the federal government paid farmers to conserve soil, prevent erosion, etc., by not planting crops. By this time, FDR was really upset with the Supreme Court for their decisions on NIRA and also on AAA. And he got so mad that he proposed pursuing adding 6 more justices to the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Well, people thought that he was really, going too far with this one. The Supreme Court, however, did surprisingly sort of begin to uphold New Deal legislation rather than declaring it all unconstitutional. In the election of 1936, FDR won. A Housing Act for public housing, creating the U.S. Housing Authority, was created in 1937. And the first federal minimum wage, establishing a 40-hour week, was 1938. Well, FDR did not live to see the end of World War II, and Truman, his vice president, became president and promised in the peacetime World War II era a fair deal for everyone, especially in terms of housing and health care for the poor. Unfortunately, the fair deal was partly doomed by the Cold War and by kind of the fear of any kinds of government programs that sort of made that looked to people like socialism or communism. But there was a great problem in the post-World War economy because there was inflation, there were strikes. All of these veterans, millions of veterans, were returning home. They would need to be eased back into the economy. There weren't enough jobs for all of them. So the GI Bill was passed, which was a really good idea because it not only provided, loans so that GIs, that is veterans, could go ahead and buy houses, but it also provided, the ability for them to go to college. And, as long as they went to college, they weren't literally taking jobs from people. And the second thing is they were getting degrees, which, of course, would be very important to putting more professionals out in the economy later on. One thing that, of course, Truman was very unhappy with, and in fact he vetoed it, but Congress overrode the veto, was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, sponsored by Senator Robert Taft of Cincinnati. Some labor leaders called it the Tough-Heartless Act instead of Taft-Hartley Act. It continued to allow collective bargaining, but it made it more difficult for unions to form in a workplace by allowing states to pass right-to-work laws. So it prohibited any requirements that all workers had to join a union once a majority of workers had voted for it. So in other words, it outlawed closed shops. In the 1948 election, Truman won, and in 1949 a new housing act was passed by the U.S. Congress supporting the construction of 810,000 government-owned housing units for the poor. We next turn to, there's this period of civil rights, which you're going to be covering in when we look at the chapter of African Americans. So we are concerned about that, and we will be studying that, but we're just looking at the overview now, things that kind of dealt with most everyone, and we'll mention a few specifics. As you know, in 1963, in November of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson became president. He promised a great society. He subsequently, by the way, won election in 1964, and with his landslide victory and Democratic majorities in the U.S. Congress, LBJ called for a great society to pass laws on civil rights and also to bring about changes in medical care, education, poverty, and the environment. This great society of his declared war on poverty and saw the passage of Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for poor people, that is health insurance for them, a new Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUB, in 1965, a Higher Education Act in 1965, which gave federal assistance to colleges and universities, a Model Cities Act in 1966 to eliminate slums in cities. And then along came our growing involvement as a nation in the Vietnam War. The cost of the Vietnam War and the nation's attention went from the war on poverty to the war in Southeast Asia. So the war on poverty never really had a chance to kind of finish off what it had intended in the first place. In the meantime, American Indians, that is Native American leaders, occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, protesting against the government. So the rights of Native Americans came to the forefront. The rights of Hispanics came to the forefront with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers in 1962. The rights of gays and lesbians began to come to the forefront in 1969 with the riots at a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, in 5 days of fighting which ensued after that. The rights of women were expressed by people like Betty Friedan and others who founded the National Organization of Women to promote women's rights. They and others fought for an Equal Rights Amendment to end gender discrimination. 3/4 of the states were needed to ratify it, and, it never got to that point. And what we do know also is that under President Ford, an earned income tax credit was passed, which is basically kind of a reverse income tax. If you were working full-time and you were poor and you paid taxes, you might actually get a refund or a rebate higher than the taxes you paid. And if you didn't have to pay any taxes, you might get a refund, that is literally a subsidy. And all of this was kind of a reverse income tax in order to help people who were below the poverty line raise their income above the poverty line. Now, that earned income tax credit continues today, and it continued in the election of 1980 and afterwards when Ronald Reagan became president. Not long after, a couple years after he became president, the worst economic recession since the Great Depression hit the United States. Of course, it's been, now it's the second worst since the 2008 recession, since the Great Depression. But it was a very bad recession. And Ronald Reagan and others believed that the ideas of John Maynard Keynes of government intervention were not helping the economy. Rather, they believed in a reversal of Keynesian economics. They believed in supply-side economics, or sometimes called trickle-down economics. They didn't want government intervention. Instead, they proposed tax cuts for the very wealthy and corporations, in the hopes that these tax cuts would encourage increases in production and then trickle down to the middle class, who would then buy more stuff. That is, there would be higher consumption. So they followed through with supply-side economics in the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which is an example of supply-side economics. It was the largest tax cut in U.S. history. Rates for people in the lowest income bracket dropped from 14% to 11%, and in the highest brackets they dropped from 70% to 50%. It was followed 5 years later by the Tax Reform Act, which dropped taxes further to a maximum of 28% on individuals. Now, all of this was happening at the same time, so the idea of going from Keynesian economics and government intervention to kind of supply-side economics, part of that, too, was a war against welfare, because welfare was government intervention in the economy. So in election of 1988, George W. Bush, who had been vice president under Reagan, ran against Michael Dukakis, and he won the election. His administration would see passage of the American with Disabilities Act, a very important act. A supply-side president like Reagan before him, Bush promised no new taxes, but he ended up having to raise taxes anyhow. Not a very popular thing. In an election of 1992, William Jefferson, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, won. The election really hinged on the economy. And Clinton would win re-election in 1996. In general, under President Clinton, the economy did become prosperous. His approval ratings were high, despite the fact that some scandals, such as the Monica Lewinsky scandal, occurred. Government revenues were up. There was actually a surplus. The national debt, was being paid down. In 1994, however, Republicans took control of both houses of Congress, led by Newt Gingrich, the new Speaker of the House. And so they were increasingly concerned about government intervention and more interested in supply side, and particularly concerned in about welfare. So they passed a new act in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which ended aid to family with dependent children that had been started in 1933. It was signed by Clinton and essentially did two things. Number one, it made welfare a state function. The federal government still provided block grants to help with it, but welfare became a state function. Number two, it made welfare temporary. So anybody on welfare had to find a job within 2 years, and there would be a lifetime limit of 5 years on welfare. Now, the immediate results were not very apparent because the economy was so prosperous that the effects were minimal. Plus, the earned income tax credit was still around, and so it helped the poor. Clinton was kind of a middle-of-the-road president. He literally did things that were popular with both sides and was a kind of president who could bring about some consensus and collaboration, and he worked with Congress. He signed a new free trade zone between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. and he signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade of the World Trade Organization, which contained 135 members and led to tariff reductions as well. In 2000, George W. Bush, the son of President Bush, a Republican, won against the Democratic candidate Al Gore. Bush believed that every school in the U.S. needed to meet annual testing standards, and so brought into effect in 2002 the program known as No Child Left Behind. Also, a Medicare prescription plan. So formerly under Medicare, there was no prescription plan for seniors. There was as of 2003. And then during the very end of Bush's second term in fall of 2008, there was an economic meltdown which became the worst recession since the Great Depression. In 1 year, the network of the U.S. dropped $11 trillion. President Obama was elected, put in an American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of $787 billion as a fiscal stimulus. We will study much more about this and about our other topics later on. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a great week.